The video opens with a slow, creeping shot across the dimly lit living room of Grandma's old house, the last strands of evening light stretching across the floor like fading memories. The camera moves with deliberate patience, as though afraid to disturb the stillness, revealing ordinary objects that somehow feel extraordinary in the hush of dusk. Family photos, crochet blankets, antique shelves, all quietly watching. But the focus inevitably draws toward the red chair in the far corner, its once bright fabric now faded, yet strangely vivid in the dying glow of sunset. The narrator's voice enters softly, almost whispering, as though remembering something that still makes the heart tremble. My grandmother had only one rule in this house: never, ever sit in the red chair after sunset. As this rule hangs in the air, the camera lingers on the chair, capturing the way the shadows cling to its wooden arms, the way the cushion seems to dip inward like someone had just stood up, and the way the room itself feels colder in its presence. Even viewers, without knowing the story yet, sense that this chair is not just a piece of furniture. It is a boundary, a warning, a quiet guardian of something dark and unspoken. The narrator then begins to peel back the layers of childhood memory, describing the strange mix of warmth and unease that defined every visit to Grandma's house. By day, the home felt alive with sunlight and comfort, full of the smell of baked bread and the soft humming of Grandma's favorite old songs. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, everything changed. The house grew quieter, the shadows deepened, and the air grew heavy with a tension that was impossible to name as a child. The red chair, which sat innocently in the corner during the morning, became the center of an invisible weight at night, as though it pulled the darkness toward it. Grandma would glance at it often, her kind eyes turning serious, and she would gently remind everyone in a voice that trembled just enough to be noticed. No sitting there after dark, not even for a second. She never explained why. She never even wanted questions about it. And her refusal to speak about it made the rule feel less like superstition and more like a matter of survival. The introduction expands as the narrator recalls how Grandma's fear seemed subtle but constant, stitched into the rhythm of her evenings. She always made sure to close the curtains tightly before the last line of sunlight vanished, pulling them shut with a speed that felt out of place for her slow, aging hands. She would avoid walking near the red chair entirely after dusk, choosing longer routes around the room, even if it meant taking twice as many steps. Sometimes, as a child, you'd catch her glancing at the chair with an expression that didn't belong on her gentle face, an expression filled with sadness, fear, and the kind of memory that hurts too much to retell. On rare nights when the house felt especially restless, you could see her whisper something under her breath when she passed the chair, as if speaking to someone only she could see. At the time, you assumed it was just the imagination of being young, but now, thinking back, you realize her whispers were too intentional, too sorrowful to be anything less than real. The camera in the video begins to tighten its focus on the smallest details, the worn patches on the chair's fabric, the faint scratches on the wooden floor beneath its legs, the subtle indentation in the cushion that never seemed to lift no matter how many days passed. The narrator describes how sometimes the chair seemed to creak on its own late at night, the kind of creak that didn't match the house settling or furniture shifting, but sounded instead like someone shifting their weight slowly, carefully. The family dog would refuse to enter the living room after sunset, standing at the doorway with its ears pulled back, staring at the chair as if expecting someone unseen to rise from it. Even guests who knew nothing about the rule found themselves uncomfortable when near the chair after dark, often saying, "It just feels strange over there," without fully knowing why. These small moments, these tiny but unmistakable signs, wove themselves together into a quiet understanding among everyone who visited. The red chair held a presence, and that presence awakened only after sunset. As the introduction deepens, the narrator shifts into the emotional heart of the mystery, explaining how this strange rule followed them throughout childhood, like a shadow they didn't fully understand but always respected. Every story Grandma told, every caution she gave, seemed somehow connected to that chair, even if she pretended they weren't. Sometimes she would pause in the middle of speaking, her eyes drifting unconsciously toward the chair, as if expecting someone to be sitting there. Other times, she would abruptly end conversations when the room grew too dark, pushing everyone toward the kitchen or the bedrooms with a tense smile and a soft command to let the living room rest for the night. These habits made no sense then, but they formed the backbone of the family's unspoken agreement to obey the one rule without question. And though no one admitted it out loud, everyone felt the same thing, that the chair wasn't empty. Not really, not entirely. The moment everything changed. The summer they returned to take care of Grandma when she grew older and frailer, and the rule about the red chair became more urgent than ever before. The house felt different that summer, quieter, heavier, filled with the weight of years of secrets pressing against the walls. Grandma's health was fading, but her fear of the red chair grew sharper, clearer, almost desperate. She began placing small objects around the chair every evening: salt, matches, silver coins, items meant to ward off something unseen. When asked what she was protecting the family from, she only replied, "Not what, who." And with those words, the hook and introduction draw to a close, pulling the viewer into a chilling story of memory, fear, and the haunting truth about why Grandma never sat in the red chair after sunset. The evening breeze carried a strange stillness the first time I noticed Grandma refusing to sit in the red chair after sunset, as if the wooden frame held secrets no one else in the family could understand. And the way her eyes lingered on it with a mix of fear and grief made me realize this wasn't just an old woman's superstition. I remember standing in the living room, watching the last sliver of daylight fade through the window, and the chair, beautifully carved mahogany with deep crimson upholstery, seemed to darken faster than the rest of the room, almost as if the night swallowed it first. Grandma, who usually spent her evenings quietly sewing or humming old lullabies, suddenly grew tense, her needle pausing mid-air, her lips tightening as the shadow of the chair stretched across the floor toward her feet. And she whispered sharply for me to close the curtains before the last ray of sunlight disappeared. At that moment, I realized this wasn't the first time she had reacted that way, because now that I thought back, she always made sure she wasn't anywhere near that chair once dusk settled, even going as far as avoiding eye contact with it, like it was something alive that she preferred not to provoke. I remembered the way she once told my younger cousin to never sit there after dark, her tone unusually firm for someone who hardly raised her voice, and the childlike fear in my younger cousin. Cousin's face showed that Grandma's warning held a weight far heavier than a simple household rule. For years, I assumed it was an old person quirk, maybe a superstition from her childhood village. But the more I watched her interact, or rather refuse to interact with the red chair, the more I sensed a deeper story woven into her silence. Whenever the sun dipped below the horizon, Grandma quietly gathered her things and moved to the opposite side of the room, positioning herself so that the chair remained behind her, as if looking at it after dark was somehow dangerous. And every night, without fail, she placed her hand over her heart, murmuring a prayer under her breath, her voice trembling slightly, before turning her face away from the deepening shadows pooling around the chair. Something shifted the first night I decided to stay awake and quietly observe Grandma's behavior instead of going to my room as she instructed, because I wanted to understand what unspoken fear tied her to such a peculiar rule about the chair. As the clock approached 9, the house fell into a hush so complete it made the ticking sound louder than usual. And in that silence, I swore I heard the faint creak of wood coming from the corner where the red chair stood, even though no one had touched it. Grandma, sitting far from it on the opposite side of the room, immediately stiffened as if the sound confirmed something she wished desperately to ignore. And the look in her eyes wasn't just fear, it was recognition. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she folded them in her lap, her knuckles whitening under the dim light of the lamp, and she refused to turn her head toward the chair, no matter how softly the wood groaned again. The air grew colder near the floor, as though something unseen was settling in, and even I felt a subtle shift, like the room had gained another quiet occupant we couldn't see but could somehow feel. My curiosity, stronger than my caution, made me inch a little closer, but when Grandma whispered my name sharply, too sharply, my heart jumped because her voice carried a warning far heavier than words. She told me not to approach it, not even during the day, unless she was present, and even then, I should avoid touching the arms or the top rail, as if those parts held a memory she wished she could erase from the furniture itself. The tension in her voice made me hesitate, but the mystery lingering around the chair felt like a thin veil hiding something old and waiting, and I sensed that whatever scared her wasn't just in her mind. When the floorboard near the chair creaked once more, louder this time, Grandma shut her eyes tightly and began reciting a verse under her breath, a verse I'd only ever heard her whisper during funerals. I wanted to ask her why she reacted that way, but the fear in her voice when she told me to never acknowledge the chair when it calls drained every word from my throat, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The room felt heavier, the shadows thicker, and in that charged silence, I started to truly believe that whatever Grandma feared about that red chair after sunset wasn't superstition. It was something real, something she had lived through, and something she hoped to keep me away from at any cost. The next morning, sunlight softened the fear from the night before, and for a moment, I wondered if everything I'd sensed was just my imagination feeding off the silence of the house. But the way Grandma avoided looking at the chair even in daylight told me the fear was real. She moved around it carefully, almost respectfully, as though acknowledging its presence would break some invisible boundary that protected us during the day. And I noticed her fingers brushing the wooden surface only once, lightly, briefly, as if checking whether the energy from the night had truly faded. When she caught me watching, she quickly drew her hand back and offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile meant to reassure, but instead revealed how deeply controlled her fear had become. Later that afternoon, I asked her directly why the chair unsettled her, hoping that daylight might loosen her tongue, but she simply shook her head and insisted that some stories were too painful to revisit. Her eyes drifted toward the open window where the breeze fluttered the curtains, and she told me that not all hauntings are made of ghosts. Some are made of memories, grief, and promises broken under circumstances no one could understand. I heard the weight in her words, the heaviness of something left unsaid, and although she didn't offer details, her silence felt like a wall built to protect both of us from a past she refused to relive. But that wall cracked slightly that evening when I caught her holding an old photograph she thought I wouldn't notice, a faded picture of a man I'd never seen before, sitting in the same red chair with a half smile that looked both proud and troubled. She pressed the picture to her chest when she realized I was behind her, and for the first time, her voice trembled not with fear, but with sorrow, as she whispered that he used to call it the thinking chair, where he would sit for hours whenever something burdened his mind. There was a softness in her eyes when she spoke of him, a tenderness tangled with pain, and I sensed instantly that the chair had belonged to someone she loved deeply and lost even more painfully. Still, she refused to tell me why the chair became forbidden after sunset, insisting that some hours of the day held energies we shouldn't disturb, especially when tied to people who left this world with unfinished emotions. Her warning echoed in my mind long after she walked away, and the more I thought about the photograph, the more I felt the chair wasn't just an object. It was a doorway to a memory she feared would step back into the present if we weren't careful. And as dusk approached again, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened in that chair years ago still lingered in its wooden frame, waiting for the night to bring it to life again. By the time I reached my teenage years, the red chair had transformed in my mind from a simple object of curiosity into something charged with a presence I could almost feel pressing against my skin whenever I entered the living room at night. Grandma's rule was now etched into every corner of my memory. Never sit there after sunset, she would remind me with a quiet intensity that made my own heartbeat feel loud in the stillness of the house. At first, I obeyed, curious but respectful. Yet the more I obeyed, the more I noticed subtle signs that the chair wasn't empty, that it seemed to exist in a layer of reality slightly out of sync with the rest of the room, rocking ever so gently, even when the floorboards beneath it remained untouched. One evening, long after dinner, and while Grandma had gone upstairs, I found myself sneaking glances toward the chair, my pulse quickening as shadows grew longer and the room dimmed to the warm amber tones of dusk. I thought I saw a faint silhouette sitting there, the outline of a figure perfectly still, yet unmistakably human, staring back at me with an expression that made my stomach knot. As I blinked, the silhouette vanished, leaving only the stillness of the empty chair, and a shiver ran down my spine because I knew that my eyes had not deceived me. Something had been there, waiting, perhaps testing whether I would notice. From that night onward, every evening became a small ritual of observation. The chair seemed to respond to our movements, to the subtle sounds of the room, and even the faint scent of dust and old fabric carried a strange heaviness that wasn't there in other furniture. Grandma's behavior became more noticeable too. She would whisper under her breath more frequently, check the windows, adjust small objects around the chair, and always keep her distance, as though some unseen boundary existed between her and the crimson fabric. Occasionally, the dog would growl at the empty chair, low and throaty, refusing to enter the room. And once, even a gust of wind through a slightly open window sent the curtains flaring directly toward the chair, but the air around it remained unnaturally still. The house itself seemed to hold its breath whenever I approached, every creak of the floorboard amplified, every shadow stretching unnaturally long. In those moments, I understood that the chair carried memory, presence, and perhaps even sorrow, and that Grandma's insistence to avoid it after sunset was a warning rooted in experiences far older and more real than I could imagine at the time. One summer evening, curiosity finally got the better of me, and I decided to examine the red chair closely while Grandma rested in her room upstairs, hoping to discover even the smallest clue about what made it so forbidden. The light from the late afternoon sun slanted across the room, catching tiny scratches on the arms and legs of the chair, faded stains on the upholstery, and subtle indentations that suggested something or someone had left an impression long ago. I traced my fingers over the cushion and felt a firmness in the center that didn't match the rest of the seat, like a memory pressed permanently into the fabric, and a chill ran through me as though the chair itself was aware of my attention. Beneath the cushion, I discovered a small folded envelope, yellowed with age, tucked carefully in the seam, almost as if someone had placed it there intentionally to be found only under specific conditions. I opened it cautiously and found a short letter written in careful, elegant handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, but full of longing, apology, and sorrow. The words spoke of loss, regret, and unfinished moments, and as I read them aloud, the room seemed to sigh around me, the faint sound of a floorboard creaking from the chair's corner adding to the sensation that the letter had been waiting to be read for decades. Examining the floor near the chair revealed faint marks in the polished wood, as though something heavy had been dragged or pressed against it repeatedly, almost ritualistically. Dust patterns indicated that objects had been moved around the chair over time, perhaps offerings or attempts at protection, though what they protected against remained unclear. Every small clue seemed to confirm that the red chair was more than furniture. It was a vessel, a repository of memory and grief, imbued with the weight of the past, and that weight pressed on the present, just as Grandma had warned. I hesitated to touch the chair further, feeling the pull of something invisible, a presence that both invited and forbade interaction. The dog, who had followed me into the room, whimpered softly and backed away from the chair, its instinctive fear validating what I had only suspected. The red chair carried more than wood and fabric. It carried an unseen story, alive and waiting, and my investigation had only just begun to reveal the depths of what Grandma had spent decades protecting me from. By the time Grandma came downstairs, the sun was setting, and I quickly hid the letter, knowing she would notice and disapprove if I disturbed the chair. But I also knew the veil of mystery surrounding it was thinning, and the truth would soon demand its revelation. That evening, as the last orange streaks of sunlight faded from the sky, Grandma finally allowed me to sit nearby the red chair while she spoke, her voice heavy with emotion, trembling as though every word carried decades of untold grief. She told me, for the first time, the story of her brother, the young man in the photograph, who had spent countless hours in the chair, thinking through decisions that haunted him long after he left the world, leaving behind unfinished plans and unresolved sorrow that seemed to cling to the chair itself. Her words painted a picture of loss so raw and vivid that the room seemed to shift around us, shadows deepening unnaturally, as though listening to the recounting of memories too heavy for daylight. Grandma explained that after sunset, the energy of the house changed, the boundaries between past and present thinned, and the red chair became a focal point for lingering emotions that could not find peace. "It's not haunted in the way people imagine ghosts," she said softly, her hands shaking as she rested them on the arm of the chair. "It's the weight of memory, the echoes of love and regret, and the threads that tie us to those we have lost." I could see her resolve and sorrow intertwined, the same care she had shown all these years to protect the family from this invisible burden, now laid bare in her confession. She recounted nights when she had heard whispering in the room or felt the chair rock slightly without anyone near it, events she could never explain but had learned to respect and live with quietly. Objects left near the chair, small charms, letters, or coins, were her way of acknowledging and soothing the lingering presence, a ritual of care that kept the weight bearable without disturbing its balance. Listening to her, I understood the rules were never arbitrary. They were a combination of protection, reverence, and love, meant to honor the memory of someone who could not complete his story in life. By the time she finished speaking, the room was dark, and the red chair sat silently in the corner, still and solemn. I realized the warnings, the cold spots, the unease, and even the dog's instinctive fear were all reflections of the same truth. The chair was alive with memory, and the energy of the past demanded respect. That night, Grandma's confession lifted a veil of mystery I had chased for years, replacing fear with understanding, and I finally saw the red chair for what it truly was, a vessel of remembrance, a silent guardian of stories too precious to be ignored, and a reminder that some memories, though invisible, shape the world around us in ways we can feel but not always see. After the revelation, the atmosphere in the living room shifted, carrying a quiet reverence where tension once lived, and even the fading light seemed softer, as though acknowledging the story Grandma had finally shared. The red chair remained untouched after sunset, but the fear that had once clung to it transformed into a deep respect, a sense that we were in the presence of something sacred rather than something dangerous. Family members, including myself, ourselves pausing near it, almost instinctively lowering our voices and approaching with care, as if the chair had become a silent witness to the emotions and history embedded in its fabric. We began sharing memories, not just of Grandma's brother, but of moments that connected us to him through her stories, photographs, and mementos left carefully around the house. Small items, an old scarf, a faded book, a coin placed beneath the cushion, were treated as gentle reminders of the life once lived, and I realized how much meaning an object could carry when it held so many layers of emotion. Conversations became softer, smiles tinged with nostalgia, and laughter occasionally emerged, not from frivolity, but from the warmth of remembrance and shared understanding that we were honoring someone whose presence still lingered among us. Even the dog, who had always avoided the chair, began approaching cautiously during the day, sniffing the air and relaxing near its base, as though sensing the shift from fear to acceptance. Grandma herself moved with a lighter step, no longer retreating from the chair at sunset, but quietly sitting nearby, offering prayers and whispered words of remembrance that seemed to calm the lingering energy in the room. I began to understand that the red chair's power was not in terror, but in memory, in grief, and in the invisible threads of connection it held, binding the past to the present in a way that demanded patience, respect, and reflection. In those quiet evenings, the chair became more than a piece of furniture. It became a symbol of family, continuity, and the unspoken lessons that history can impart. We learned that some warnings, some traditions, and some objects are vessels of memory that guide behavior and preserve love in ways we might not immediately see. The house felt warmer, fuller, and alive with stories, and each glance at the red chair reminded me that respect for the past could coexist with curiosity, teaching a balance between reverence and understanding that would stay with me forever. The final evening arrived with a soft twilight that bathed the living room in amber hues, and the red chair sat quietly in the corner, empty yet commanding attention, as if it had absorbed every story, every memory, every whisper it had ever witnessed. I watched Grandma settle into her usual chair across the room, her hands folded gently in her lap, eyes occasionally drifting toward the red chair, now free of tension but heavy with the weight of remembrance. The air felt calm, almost reverent, as though the house itself had learned to breathe easier, carrying the stories of loss and love without the tension of fear that had once gripped it. Family members moved about quietly, talking in hushed tones, sharing photographs and small mementos near the chair, each gesture an acknowledgement of the life and memory it held. The dog, no longer fearful, padded softly around the room, occasionally pausing to glance at the crimson fabric with a neutral curiosity, no growls or whimpers escaping its throat. Even the shadows seemed to respect the space, stretching lightly across the wooden floor without the oppressive weight they had carried before, leaving the red chair as a solemn, silent guardian of the past. Grandma spoke softly to me, her voice filled with a mixture of sorrow, pride, and peace, explaining that the chair's purpose had always been to protect, to honor, and to remind us that memory can be alive in objects if we pay attention. "It's not about fear," she said. "It's about respect for those who have passed, for the stories that shape us, and for the love that never dies." Her words lingered in the room like a gentle echo, and I realized that every creak, every chill, every shadow we had once feared was just a sign of the life that memories still carried within the red chair. As night fell completely, I sat for a moment alone, gazing at the crimson upholstery, feeling its presence without fear, sensing its story without intrusion. The camera would linger, if this were a video, on the chair in quiet dignity, while the soft sounds of a clock ticking and a faint breeze whispered through the curtains. And then I would ask the audience softly, would you dare to sit in the red chair, knowing it carries memory, grief, and love beyond your understanding? The house fell silent, leaving the red chair as it always had been, a vessel of history, a keeper of emotions, and a quiet teacher of respect, memory, and the invisible threads that tie the past to the present.